As New Zealand mourns those killed by a lone gunman in 2 mosques, calls grow for a clampdown on Islamophobia. But what's driving the hatred and prejudice against Muslims in Western countries? And is it linked to white supremacy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Hazem, Sika. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern calls it a terrorist attack. 50 people shot dead in 2 mosques in the city of Christchurch. A man suspected to be a white supremacist is charged with murder, and it has emerged a 74-page manifesto full of hate against Muslims and immigrants was sent to the Prime Minister and others just minutes before the attacks. In it, the suspect described the US President Donald Trump as a symbol of renewed white identity. When Trump asked Ardern what he could do to help, she told him to show sympathy and love for all Muslim communities. She says New Zealand gun laws will now change. Now, let's remind ourselves of some previous attacks. In 2015, white supremacist Dylan Roof killed 9 African Americans in a church in Charleston, South Carolina. The following year, Oscar Morrell shot dead an imam and his assistant near their mosque in Queens, New York. In 2017, 6 worshippers were killed by gunman Alexander Bissonnette at a mosque in Quebec City in Canada. In the same year, Darren Osborne drove a van into a group of people leaving a mosque in London, killing 1 man. And last year, white supremacist Robert Bowers shot and killed 11 Jews at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Well, let's bring in our guests now to talk more about this. In Melbourne, via Skype, we have cross-cultural consultant Tasneem Chopra. She is also chair of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights. In Beirut, Rodger Shanahan, a research fellow at the Lowy Institute, an Australian think tank. And joining us from London, Matthew Goodwin, a professor at the University of Kent and former member of the UK government's anti-Muslim hatred working group. Good to have you all with us. Tasneem Chopra, if I could start with you then. When you heard about this attack, what went through your mind first? Were you surprised by it, shocked? I mean, given what your own country is going through, what was your first reaction?
It was, I think, the environment for this kind of attack culminating the way that it did has been fermenting for some time. And I think it was always a question of when. Yet I didn't take away from the tragedy and the mourning and the grief that I'm continuing to navigate through at the moment. But I think the inevitability of it was something that sadly many of my contemporaries felt was just a matter of time.
Rodger Shanahan, what were your first feelings when you heard about this?
I think everybody felt the same disgust and shock at what had happened to these people who are peacefully going about observing their religion. It still did come probably as more of a shock that the fact that it happened in New Zealand, which is rarely touched by this kind of attack, and doubly so because an Australian citizen was responsible for it. So I think combination of all of those things, the rarity of the event, particularly in the location in New Zealand, but also just the shock and horror about the carnage that had been caused in this terrorist attack.
Yeah, what about the fact that this happened in New Zealand, Matthew Goodwin? I mean, like many people, I'm sure you were shocked and horrified by this, and for many people who study this, perhaps some were not surprised. But the fact that this happened in a country like New Zealand, which is known for being a very tolerant, liberal society.
Well, indeed. Sadly, the mass shooting element was not as surprising as perhaps it would have been in the past. But what was surprising, certainly to me, was that this occurred in New Zealand. It reminded me actually of the attacks in Norway. Again, 2 countries, Norway and New Zealand, that are known around the world for being very tolerant, very liberal, very relaxed, and yet both going through quite shocking events. And particularly in terms of politics, we've had a very vigorous debate about the rise, for example, of right-wing politics, ultra-right-wing politics in the United States and Europe, and perhaps that's taken our attention away from some of these other areas of the world that are grappling with some of the same challenges and same problems.
Tasneem, Chopra, let me come back to you then. The suspect is, as it turns out, is Australian. And does it surprise you at all that given the climate in Australia right now, were things there a kind of a breeding ground for what led him to this?
Sure. And I don't believe this. These incidents happen in a vacuum. They do happen on the grounds, or as part of an extenuating history of what can only be described as a right-wing rhetoric-based sort of environment that has defined a lot of the political leadership that we have seen, and certainly a lot of the media climate and shock jocks and influences in that space. So the language that's being used to demonize and pillarize Muslims or refugees or minorities has been one that has garnered a lot of political currency, a lot of legitimacy, a lot of free time and air has been given to leaders to actually espouse views of hate and rhetoric in the name of national security, in the name of securing borders, both here and abroad. And often those comments have been made without any position or opportunity for there to be a counterband response from those communities who are constantly being demonized. So there's almost like an open slather culture, if you will, that has demonized and has been very, very xenophobic. So we'll call it Islamophobia because that's essentially what it is. It has basically created an environment that has legitimized Islamophobia as normal. So when people talk about being surprised at the actions of Brendan and Taryn, I'm not surprised at all. I think this is the end result of encouraging division, naming Muslims and Islam as not belonging in this country, basically claiming that they have no legitimate values or rights that are consistent with the values of this nation, to the point where it's made commentators abroad at least and right-wing pundits go to issues of final solution or replacement theory, legitimizing actual tactical maneuvers to solve the Muslim problem.
When you say there that the political leadership in Australia has given many of these people cover, what do you mean by that? Expand on that.
Well, I think just the recent example of, in response to what happened in New Zealand, Senator Fraser Anning has made a statement, which I'm not sure if he's taken down yet or not, but there's been a lot of outcry from across the coalition and from across both sides of government that they don't support his views, but his views were, as an elected member of parliament, that essentially the actions of what happened represent people's discomfort with Muslim migration, and that in fact Muslims themselves were to blame for their murder. That's an egregious and a really horrific thing for someone to say, not just because of the climate that we're in, but because of how flawed that argument is and how that precise mentality then actually fuels and gives invective to others to copycat what Brendan has done. So as a leader, as someone supposedly of responsibility in this country, to then take the view that it's understandable and we can see why it happened, and justifying it is absolutely appalling.
Rodger Shanahan, how would you characterise the current climate in Australia towards the Muslim community and towards immigration in general, knowing, of course, that the Australian government has taken quite a firm stance against refugees, quite a controversial one?
Listen, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'd probably say to start with two things. Before we start attributing blame and influences on who influenced this person in the cowardly attack that he carried out, you really need to wait a period of time to find out his social media background, his conversational background, his travel background, to find out who has actually influenced him. It's very easy to say that the whole environment influenced him, but I've been an expert witness in more than 24 terrorism trials here in Australia, and you get the real understanding of what has driven this person from the collection of telephone intercepts, from their history of searches on the internet and the dark net, that's when you really understand what motivated this person. So the unfortunate reality is we're going to have to wait some time before we can actually understand who influenced this person. And it's going to be critical to understanding that factor before we can address some further issues. And probably on another issue about why New Zealand, and this is an issue that will take up some people's time. And if you go from the fact that this person had obviously decided at some point with his hatred of Muslims that he wanted to kill as many as possible, it's highly possible that he chose New Zealand as the place to do it because of their relatively lax gun laws. Gun laws much tighter in Australia, and one of the things that has frustrated Islamist terrorists in Australia previously has been their inability to access semi-automatic weapons. So it's quite possible that this person travelled to New Zealand and either with a specific purpose or over a period of time decided that New Zealand was an easier target than Australia. On the broader issue of migration and attitude to Muslims, what Senator Fraser Anning has said is deplorable. Hopefully tomorrow there's going to be a bipartisan censure of him by both the government and the Labor Party. We also have to remember that, yes, he was an elected representative, but he achieved 19 votes in Queensland, and due to a range of peculiarities with our electoral system and the fact that some of the people ahead of him on the ballot had to leave because of citizenship queries, he ended up in Parliament. Absolutely, he's an elected representative, but this is really a reflection of him as an individual about what he's been saying, and the fact that he got 19 votes probably tells you all you need to know about how much popular support he has. He's just a person with a platform and particularly offensive views, and I think the government and the opposition are doing exactly the right thing and marginalising him and his views. On the whole issue about migration, as you said, sorry, I'll let you go on.
Sorry, we'll come back to that in a moment, but I want to get Matthew Goodwin's view on this. Do you think politicians have fuelled a lot of this as well, and as others have said, given legitimacy to many white nationalists?
Well, I certainly think it's part of the explanation. If you look at democracies since the 1980s, we've really seen a rise in populist movements, a more exclusionary language. That's become especially prominent since the 2000s. But as I said earlier on, and to reiterate some of the statements made by the previous speaker, when you're dealing with individuals, it's often very difficult to identify what was that causal mechanism that pushed them into perpetrating violence. So if you look, for example, at a lot of the research we have in Europe, particularly Germany, where the German authorities have looked at perpetrators very closely, they often say that they tend to be young or middle-aged men. They tend to have low levels of education. They often have a background of alcohol or drug abuse or petty criminality. But often, those generalizations, they don't always hold up. Sometimes you find individuals who have been flirting with right-wing extremist movements, but not necessarily being active members in those groups. For example, the murderer of the Labour politician here in the UK, Joe Cox, who had been sort of flirting around the fringes of movements, but not necessarily being highly active in them. Meanwhile, you can look at somebody like Anders Breivik, who was fully immersed in the online orbit of right-wing extremist forums. The one thing that I would add before we continue the conversation, however, is over the last 48 hours, I've noticed a lot of the debate about this issue has been about big tech and social media. We must remember that we had perpetrators of mass violence before we had big tech and social media. People like Timothy McVeigh, for example, who we conveniently forget, or David Copeland, the nail bomber here in London, who targeted homosexual communities, who we conveniently forget. Yes, big tech has a massive role to play, but we have to remember that actually these individuals can sometimes slip through the net, irrespective of what's happening in the online orbit.
So Tasneem, if I could turn back to you on this, how much of a role has the internet played on all of this? I mean, there was one former white supremacist who's in an interview said that it was like a 24-hour hate buffet, in that there's always access there to this kind of rhetoric, whereas before, in an age before the internet, you actually had to actually meet with the person there and so on. Now it's much more readily available. How much has the internet and social media fueled this kind of sentiment?
Look, I think it's a huge question, and I think it's a question that governments are grappling with now, and certainly in the wake of New Zealand, it's pretty much all-consuming issue. So yes, I mean, social media is a beast. It is responsible for propagating mistruths and certainly for fanning the flames of division and hateful rhetoric through experiences of live stream video, for example. But then, by the same token, it's also the cause of enormous, positivity. For example, today, I believe in Brisbane, in the northern part of Australia, there was a vigil held outside a mosque to commemorate what had happened, or to mourn the loss of lives in New Zealand. And so many people wanted to attend it but couldn't, so they live streamed the service, which was kind of ironic in view of what has happened. Yet it was considered to be a viable way of disseminating this information because it was understood to be a very positive thing to do. So I think it can be weaponized for good or bad, and that is the nature of human beings. They're going to do things either way. How do you police that, though, is a far more critical question, and I think that's something that Facebook is grappling with, and rightly so.
Rodger Shanahan, how do you combat this sort of thing? I mean, there are so many websites and so many areas on the internet, on the dark web and so on, which you talked about earlier, where people can go, and the authorities only have a fixed number of people to monitor people. I mean, they can't monitor everyone, can they? What needs to be done?
Yeah, listen, it's a massive challenge for law enforcement and security agencies, and as you pointed out, it's a bit like whack-a-mole. As soon as you shut down one service, another one will pop up. I suppose this is, it's maybe cold comfort, I suppose, but while it's a weakness, it's also a potential source of exploitation by security and law enforcement agencies, because the more that people are on these sites and that they communicate with each other, the more you're able to get a sense of what kind of networks that these people are working in. That requires you to have some kind of understanding of some of the players within the network, so it's not necessarily all a bad thing. But when we were talking about influencers before, and we need to understand who this person's influencers were, it is possible to make it more difficult for people to access these kind of people who spin this hatred and rhetoric online, or upload their speeches, or hand over PDF documents. But that's really all that you can do. You can make it harder, but you can't stop them, because the way that some of these people are technically savvy, they'll always find a fix and a way around it. But as I said before, while there are advantages to law enforcement agencies with these things, the smarter you are as a terrorist or an extremist or a radical, the more dangerous you are, because you understand what security precautions you need to take to stay under the radar. And from all that we know about this person at the moment, he was clever enough that he wasn't on anybody's radar, or he was a solo traveller. He'd been out of the country for a number of years, so the security agencies never had him on their radar, which is quite understandable.
Matthew Goodwin, should this be a wake-up call then to not just the security services, but to politicians, that they need to be, because the criticism has been that these white nationalist groups have been kind of ignored for too long, or just kind of dismissed as a sideshow, really, as not a major threat. Is this a kind of watershed moment?
Well, it's difficult to know, and that's one of the sad things about where we are, that we've had a number of mass attacks, as you mentioned at the beginning of the programme, and yet we still find ourselves facing this question of are things going to finally change? I think if you go back to 2011, 2012, and you look at the reaction to the attacks by the right-wing extremist Anders Breivik, then there was I think a good example of a democracy, in that case Norway, responding quite positively to that attack. It invested heavily in research, it set up a new centre, it bolstered security powers, it allowed, I think, the debate to move on to looking at actually what causes these attacks and to invest quite heavily in that. But I think in other democracies, you haven't really seen that kind of investment in the aftermath of an attack. And I think that's one of the issues that we have to think about now, which is not only how does New Zealand move on from this, and I think the first debate will be how does New Zealand change its gun laws, and I think that's a sort of something that's a bit of a no-brainer, if you like, for New Zealand. I suspect they'll do that quite quickly. But longer term, it's actually how do democracies better tool themselves, better equip themselves to deal with some of these issues. And I can say when I was on the UK government group on anti-Muslim hatred, one of my frustrations, indeed the reason that I resigned from that group, was that at that particular time, the UK government wasn't serious about investing in this issue. It saw attempts to tackle Islamophobia more as being tokenistic, as being symbolic, but not necessarily putting the resources behind those initiatives in a way that would actually make them have an impact. And I found that incredibly frustrating.
Tasneem, Chopra, how much do you think is this down to fear of immigration, this, what's been called a kind of demographic fear of the other and so on?
I think it's been absolutely central. And I think, it's interesting when we've had this conversation regarding, terrorist suspects, the return of ISIS recruits, governments in the West are very, very strident about not allowing them back in. We had it happened in the UK, it's happened in Australia, we've had that conversation. Because they're always looking for an option to deport dual citizens. We don't want to deal with that. We don't want to make that our problem. In this particular instance, the terrorist is an Australian. There is no way to deport him. This is a product of, like I mentioned earlier, a long systemic culture that has enabled this kind of thinking to happen. And rather than question where was he radicalised and look to attack and deal with that issue, we do hear crickets. We do hear crickets. There is nothing being said in response. In fact, we know I believe in the US, with the recent administration, they actually took funding away from investigating right-wing supremacist terrorism because it's not considered to be a viable area of research. And all the resources are being allocated to Islamist terrorism. In Australia, I don't even know what the situation is, except we do know the intelligence will tell us, both in the US and in Australia, that right-wing terrorism is the largest growing form of domestic terrorism in the countries. But it's not a sexy election spiel. Nobody wants to strengthen our borders against white supremacists because it's a very uncomfortable thing to do.
Rodger Shanahan, I'm going to give what's going to be the last word to you. How much of a role has immigration played in all of this, particularly in the case of Australia?
Well, in this particular instance, from what we know from the background of the person and the manifesto, and perhaps the sites that we know that he's been active on, he's certainly anti-immigration. He's certainly anti-Muslim. He's a bigoted, radical terrorist. Now, how do you prioritise that in the list of priorities and resources that security agencies have? It's a very difficult question. There's been nearly 100 since 2015, 2014, been nearly 100 people charged in terrorism offences in Australia, and right-wing extremists account for one or two of those. The rest are radical Islamists.
All right.
So when you have a government that has a finite number of resources, they have to prioritise the threats that they perceive. And unfortunately, this person wasn't on the radar. It's a really difficult juggling act for security agencies.
Good to have you all with us. We're going to have to leave it there. Tasneem, Chopra, Rodger Shanahan and Matthew Goodwin, thanks very much for being with us. And thank you for watching. As always, you can see this program again anytime by going to our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, there's our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join us on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hazem, Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.